rolling with our program for our pre-bloom meeting for Western and Northeast New York. You all probably know me already, but I'm Mike Basedow. I'm a tree fruit specialist with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. Also joined by my colleagues from the Lake Ontario Food Program, Mario Maranasazo and Janet Van Zoren, and of course our faculty who are going to be discussing the various topics of interest today. So just a few reminders before we get rolling. If you haven't been on Zoom in a little while, just a reminder to please mute yourself just so that we're not distracted by your voice throughout the presentations. If you could also turn your camera off, that would be appreciated as well. If you'd like to ask any questions to our presenters during their presentation, you can go ahead and enter them into the chat box. If you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to hover over and that bar will pop up and you should be able to access the chat box there. As we get later through the meeting, we'll probably have some time for you to also unmute yourself if you want to ask anything directly. Again, just a reminder to please mute yourself. I do hear a couple voices coming through, so we would greatly appreciate if you could do that for us. And with that, I think that is all of my instructional stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get into the agenda. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Monique Rivera to talk about insect management. We're going to hear from Riley Harding and Dr. Kerik about disease management. And then we're going to wrap things up with some bloom thinning with Dr. Robinson. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Monique Rivera.
Oh, great. Let's run through this. So we're going to go over the most of what I think you should be thinking about at pink, which some people are already at bloom. So I also included plum curculio this time around, which I have a list here. So we'll go over San Jose scale, a little bit about oblique-banded leaf roller, rosy apple aphid, tarnished plant bug, plum curculio, some tips on mating disruption, and then an overview of the woolly apple aphid season-long management program that I have been talking about at a couple different meetings. So let's get into San Jose scale. So I think with all insects, we should think about their life cycle and how the life cycle operates in order to best manage them. So the real goal with San Jose scale is to prevent the establishment of the sessile scales. So sessile just means the thing that doesn't move. And so the key points where we need to manage this to interrupt the life cycle in order to stop their overall development in the field is to target this dormant. The dormant stage is when you could possibly try to eliminate during full inactivity, but I think that's not exactly ideal. We want them to be moving around and we want them to be more exposed. So we ultimately target this crawler stage. And so this is where we're going to get the most insecticide efficacy. And the top right-hand picture, the little guys that look almost like aphids, that's them at the crawler stage. And so we want to also try to prevent mating. So the mating will continue the population growth and they can establish quite rapidly with each female producing 200 to 400 young. So for monitoring for these guys, the goal again is to detect the first emergence of crawlers. And so what you need to do is to scout a block, usually one that's had presence of San Jose scale before, for infestation. And you can use black electrical tape wrapped around the limb, just like in the top right. And those get put out early to mid-June, but I would suggest putting them out quite a bit earlier. I think now would be a good time if you're not already monitoring, just to make sure that you're catching the earliest of the population. So we do have an available sex pheromone trap for San Jose scale, and there also is potentially on the horizon the development of pheromone-based mating disruption for this pest, but we don't have it quite yet. So the goal here is to monitor the tape about 2 times a week using a 10x hand lens. And so once you start to see the presence of these crawlers, the yellow little guys, ideally this would be a good initial treatment time. And for them, we are recommending in the early season a steam. If you haven't already, which you should have by now, at least in Western New York, spraying with a dormant oil can help with these guys. I know we've gotten away from the dormant oil in past years, but with the reduction of insecticides in our toolbox, including chlorpyrifos, I think it's important to maybe bring this back. And so this is some ways that you can target this early, still dormant stage, is you can use the oil to saturate them while we have a lot of the bark exposed before the trees are fully leafed out, in order to also try to suppress them that way. You can also, at around this timing, add in a steam, which is an insect growth regulator. Once you actually find the crawlers, we want to make sure that we potentially have the crawlers before we put these out. And so the goal is, and why we target this early time point for the potential use of the dormant oil, which I think we're slightly late for a dormant oil, but adding in the IGR there as well for enhanced control. So the real goal here is to get contact with the woody material, especially if you have established sessile scales, so that just the actual scale looking life stage of this pest on the woody material. So you're going to get great coverage at this point before we're fully leafed out. So soft insecticides for piercing sucking insects. So Movento, I want to be clear, cannot be applied until petal fall. So I'm bringing this up as a potential, but this would be used again at petal fall. Savanto is a softer material as well. It's still considered to be a bee-safe material, so I'm pretty sure you're going to have to check the label on that. But these are other options that you could potentially use that target other piercing sucking insects like aphids. And then our IGR, so Esteem and Centaur. And as I mentioned before for San Jose scale, the mating disruptions in development, it's coming. They've tested in Michigan. It looks like it works quite well. So let's get into oblique banded leaf roller. So the goal here is to examine the bud clusters for 3% larval infestation. And when it comes to these guys, if you do find up to 3% larval infestation, which is a pretty low threshold because these can also develop quite quickly, the treatment suggestions here are BT products. So Dipel, Agree, and Javelin, and there are also some other ones. Rosy apple aphid also might show up in this early part of the year. They do like the younger leaf tissue. And so in order to monitor for these guys, you want to examine clusters or terminal leaves for wingless adults and nymphs. So one infested cluster means it's time to treat. That's a really low threshold. So basically, if you find these guys, you're going to need to treat. And the treatment suggestions there are the dormant oil. So I think we're slightly late for that, but you could still slide one in. Movento, again, that can't be applied until petal fall, so hold off, and Savanto and Assail. Tarnished plant bug. So these guys sneak up on you very quick as well. And they feed on both the buds and the flower parts in the spring, which can cause aborted fruit. They have 2 to 3 generations per year, and they're active in the early season in warmer days. So we've had a couple warmer days, but not too many yet. We are at a slow start here. But particularly if you have broadleaf weeds in the row middle, you can expect these guys to show up. So to monitor for them, if you're not going to do sweep netting in the middle, you would use a white sticky panel trap along the border of the orchard, and you set those at Silvertip. So again, we're behind the 8 ball with that, but maybe not in the Champlain Valley. Maybe you guys are still early enough to put these out. So one trap every 3 to 5 acres. That's a lot. I think if you know that you have them, you know that you have them, and you know that you have to treat for them, unless we're talking about a new orchard. So when it comes to if you're going to use those traps, the action thresholds are as follows. So 3 tarnished plant bugs averaged over 5 different traps is sort of the conservative action threshold. So you can use this up until bloom if there is a history of outbreak. So again, knowing the history of the block and where you're seeing this damage is going to be critical to figuring out what to use for these insects. Now, if you're catching 5 to 8 tarnished plant bugs per 5 traps, that's considered a high population. And basically, in many cases, this is going to be a post-bloom treatment. And so the treatment suggestion for these guys, similar to brown marmorated stink bug and also plum curculio, pyrethroids are the main group to look at, but I think we're risking a lot in terms of flaring both European red mite and potentially woolly apple aphid with these guys this early in the season, hoping to give more concrete recommendations on which ones flare woolies and which ones don't by the end of this season. So let's get into one of our favorites, plum curculio. These guys are super hard to manage. And so this is what all the different stages look like. So we're looking for a tiny black weevil. Luckily, we're only dealing with these guys for 1 generation per year. So really what we're trying to do is interrupt the adult from ovipositing on the fruit. So this means timing them. And luckily there is a NUA model for these guys. But first I want to discuss some of the management assumptions that we make for plum curculio. So what we assume is that the adults overwinter outside of the apple orchard. and that they migrate into the orchard around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So during bloom, this gets pretty complicated because then your materials are more limited, but this is typically when we expect them. So the adults move in during bloom. I think we're in Western New York right at the precipice of this. And so it's definitely time to start considering plum curculio. At petal fall, this is when you start to see the ovipot, you'll actually have the damage occurring. So it's important to try to get ahead of this damage. And the length of time of this really depends on the seasonal temperatures, how fast we're accumulating degree days. And effective control does hinge, unfortunately, on preventative sprays. And then these usually are treated, from petal fall into oviposition. Sometimes people also try to target them during bloom with other products. So let's talk about the model predictions and what you can look for. So this is an example from the 2021 season. So again, a slow accumulation of degree days. And so when you're sitting at about 0 degree days for these guys based on the model, you can have an initial petal fall spray. And then as we move up to 165 degree days, again, for this particular insect, base 43, the first cover, and then we're really targeting, again, this is that petal fall window, trying to get to a 308 degree days, and this is the 40% oviposition mark and the end of them immigrating into the field. So this is a really critical time that you don't want to miss for treatment at petal fall. And then, of course, once we accumulate about almost 200 more degree days, mid-June, this is typically when we have the end control for them because we're only, again, dealing with one generation per year. So we just have to target this section. I think that this is a really complicated insect to manage. There are some new developments and some behavioral techniques of trying to manage them, but they're not quite fully refined yet. So I would highly suggest using the NUA model to just time, especially if you have a NUA device that's tracking your specific location's temperatures, to optimize these sprays to further limit damage. So if we have a cool spring, which we're having right now, this could mean that we end up with 3 sprays. So keep that in mind. This window, it just extends the window in which they're active. So be careful about that and see if you can scout for them in the orchard. There's no real clear method that I know of for them. I guess you could do beat sheets. That's how I've typically sampled for them, but that's not a typical way that we see grower sampling. However, if your consultant might do that. Let's talk codling moth and oriental fruit moth mating disruption. So now, at least in Western New York, not necessarily the Hudson Valley because you guys are further ahead, is the time to be hanging disruptors. We're trying to figure out if hanging them at an earlier time point this year could also help benefit reducing the generational developments, but that data is to come. So there's a bunch of different options for this, but let's talk about timing. So for OFM, half-inch green to tight cluster, this would have probably already needed to have gone out or should be going out ASAP for OFM. Codling moth, you can wait up until bloom, but typically if you're doing a dual species device, about now is the right time. If you're deciding to use sprayables, this is also a good timing for a first application of sprayable pheromone, and these need to be repeated about every 6 to 8 weeks or based on your trap captures in the field. So the technology here is becoming easier to use because you can have combinations, but there's a couple products. So up here, this little weird square thing is called a tangler, and we're actually testing them for the first time in New York, but they only have a single species, which is just codling moth. We're anticipating that this device could have up to 3 different species combined. But in the meantime, we are finding that these are way faster to apply than the meso dispensers, and maybe even not necessarily the puffers, but the puffers take more thought before you apply them to make sure they're applied at the rate of 1 per acre. So like I said, I think this technology is becoming more dynamic, slightly more easy to use compared to the early days of hanging 400 ties per acre. For example, we've been testing over a couple years, but not this year, what are called meso dispensers from Trace. they are applied at 32 to 38 dispensers per acre. So that's actually a lot less than the original numbers, which were about 400 per acre. And this is much like really recommended for larger blocks. If you have a smaller block, or a particularly like jagged block, this isn't ideal for that type of scenario. This is for bigger blocks. And so I think that another thing is to be careful about if you have a hilly environment, if you're going to use the puffers, the hills can disrupt the accumulation of the plume into the actual orchard. So there are some questions we still need to answer in New York. So in particular, like what does this spray program look while initiating? Dispersal of pheromone under different conditions. So that's one of the questions we're asking this year. You know, can we put it out earlier and find that we have more effective disruption in the early season? So let's get into woolly apple aphid, everybody's favorite. So let's talk about their life cycle a little bit. So with this life cycle, the goal is to try to prevent establishment. I think that that's a lofty goal. It's not a lofty goal if you have very small light populations, but if you have persistent populations, you can try your best, but these guys really do hide in the crevices and the cracks of the tree and can be hard to access. And now with the loss of chlorpyrifos, which we think is one of the driving factors, very difficult to control. So I think the idea here is to change one's mindset and that we're trying to get a tolerable level of infestation and trying to make sure it's not a runaway infestation. So if you have a light infestation, trying to catch the emerging populations on the shoots as they come out and they will have wool is ideal. But if you have a known population, you should probably be looking earlier. We've already seen them active in Western New York, not necessarily producing wool, but around and moving, meaning that, you know, they are parthenogenic. So what that means is that they can just have babies. You know, they don't need a whole lot of other interaction. They just have babies and reproduce. So one being there can mean that you're building up like a population. And so the long-term concern here is that if they do move down to the roots of the tree, this can cause physiological damage, which causes consequence to the overall health of the tree. And so I included in this talk a video because I think the early season without the wool, I think a lot of people don't quite know what that looks like because they're very reddish. So as you can see in the center of the screen, they are almost the exact same color of the bark, but you're basically looking for an aphid. And I would look for previous damage on the woody material. And that's what all this lumpiness is on this branch, is this previous material. And so you can see the carcasses that may have the dead. Potentially, they don't get rid of the carcasses because especially if they have a hole, you could have the biocontrol agent in there waiting to come out and cycle with them. So try to keep those as best you can on the tree. But here in the middle, you can see they're already starting to produce liquid honeydew, which isn't like the white wool, but it is coming out of the end of their abdomen, and they are, again, bark colored, basically. So purplish, brownish. And so it takes a much closer eye. Make sure to have a hand lens if you're going out. And I would highly recommend going to places where you've had previous infestation. So let's think about this over the course of the entire season. So dormancy, this is a timing where if we have a softer winter, you want to try to reduce overwintering populations that may be above ground. And most importantly, preserve our natural enemies. Once we get to bloom, that's when we start to have some pretty serious limitations on insecticides, in particular, what's still considered the gold standard for their control, which is Movento or Spirotetramat. And so this is limited to post-bloom applications. I've said that a couple of times. And the reason why is because this product goes systemic in the plant, and we're trying to protect the bees from accessing this product. Once we get into fruit development, there can be a late season buildup of populations around harvest, which can become problematic for harvest. And we want to, as best as possible, limit the overwintering populations that are just going to spring back up in the next year. So what do we think the best timings are for WA products? So I think that we've got 4 things that we have been talking about, or we've been working with at length here. So one of them is Safina, then Movento, and then Azadiract or Azadiractin. We're testing them and should be able to have some data after this year to actually tell you how these programs work. But right now, what we're recommending is green tip really up to like tight cluster and a steam application. We have a 2EE from Valent for this product to be used for woolly apple aphid. And then our second treatment, pre-bloom, I think Safina fits pretty well here. I have misstated in the past. Please make sure you look at the label and don't listen to me because sometimes I get the numbers wrong. But this is corrected from Kate Wheeler, not sure if she's on the call. But you've got 2 treatments of Safina per year. If you're already having infestations pre-bloom, this might be a good time to invest in that first application at 7 ounces per acre. Post-bloom, this is when we can use Movento or our Spirit Tetramat. There's also Senstar, which combines both Spirit Tetramat and a steam. And so post-bloom is when we want to use that product when the plant is still pushing out new shoots. This is going to create better uptake in the plant. And then late season, cleanup before harvest, saving the second application of Safina for this timing. Or if you have a particularly bad infestation, we hope to have more data on this after this year, but Azadirachtin, which is from neem oil. So these are the overall recommendations as they overlay for this pest from early season to late season. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. I'm running a bit short as normal.
Yeah, great job with the timing. Looks really good. So we do have one question came into chat already. If anybody else has any questions, do feel free to stick those in the chat right now. So there was one question about with the Pumpkirk that the degree day base that you had on your slide was different from the one that they say on NUA. I was not paying that close of attention, so I did not notice.
So 2 different base temperatures. And we are looking at base 43, I'm pretty sure, for plum curculio. I actually don't see a base temperature on the slides mentioned. I was
Maybe
saying
it's just what your words were then, yeah.
so 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit is what I have as like this is when they're migrating into the orchard. And then so the idea here is that you start at 0 degree days, base 43, for this insect in the NUA model. So it can get confusing with all of the other different NUA insects that are in there and trying to use that. But if you want to email me, we could also dig into this more together if needed.
Okay, perfect, great. Yeah, I guess the essential thing is that NUA is already got it figured out for you. So
yeah, so I think using NUA for that pest is really critical. But I think
yeah,
we don't have any more questions, so we should move on to the very important pathology stuff that's next.
perfect. All right. Well, thanks
everyone.
much, Monique. Great presentation as always. So we are going to now chug forwards and we're going to move over to Riley Harding and Kerik Cox, who are going to talk about the disease management. Take it away.
Great, thank you. Get my screen share. All right, so thanks, Janet, for the intro and the invite. So as Janet said, my name is Riley Harding. I'm a PhD student in Kerik's lab. So I'm excited to be joining you all today and tag teaming an apple disease update for you all. So we're going to be talking about apple scab and fire blight. So to get started, we'll go over the disease update for apple scab. So just to set the stage for what the weather events are looking like for the disease triangle. So we had a decently mild winter, warm weather starting from mid-February to early March. Warm days pretty much above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Green tip was arriving around late March to early April, depending on your region. And there were quite a few cold days and some mild spring freezes on April 1st and the 8th. So this kind of sets the stage for models might be predicting an early green tip, but just a huge caveat that computers are better at implementing degree days and they differ probably from the trees. So what the model's saying might not be lining up with what you're seeing in the field. So just keep that in mind when you're using these tools. You might have to update those dates. We also had decent snow cover this year and long interrupted wetting events with cold temps. So So it's not setting the stage for a huge apple scab epidemic, but it always does make early season applications challenging and confusing because we're not sure what's to happen ahead. So what we're seeing thus far this year, so major infection events were on April 2nd, the 9th, and the 17th, and those range from 1, 11, and 20% ascospore ejection respectively. And it also depends on when green tip actually occurred, if there was tissue that was around to be infected. But then we did have some pretty major ones last week. So on the 24th, a few days back on the 29th, and those were about 25% ascospore ejection. So we're headed kind of to the end of primary scab. And then looking forward to tomorrow, May 2nd, it's going to be a big ejection event, depending on where you're at, anywhere from 10 to 20%. So just keep that in mind. And we've got some warm, wet weather headed as well. So what we're thinking so far, it's been a pretty moderate scab season. We did have lots of rain, but the caveat is that it's been pretty cool. And so it always begs the question if it's too cool for scab. So I'm going to hand it over to Kerik, and he's going to run through some NUA models for all the regions.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Riley. Let's check out, spin the show. Switch over to NUA and let's see what we got. All right. I'm going to go through each one and sort of give you our feelings on the different areas. Riverhead, start there. You can see that Riley's prediction about 10% is coming up pretty strong. They're almost done on Long Island. 9%, 5%, 3%. And they do have an infection period happening. They're getting little bits of rain, leaf wetness hours throughout the week. And here's some of those cool days. So even that May 1st probably wasn't quite enough to actually trigger the Mills event. I'll go ahead and point something out. If you ever are wondering, like, I have so much rain and it's 43, take a look at the Mills table that we have here. See, I will zoom way the heck in because this is constructed in a rather strange manner. 43, 45, you're looking at 15 to 18 degrees leaf, at those degrees, about 15 to 18 leaf wetness hours. And what you can do is you can still get large ejections, but if you don't get enough leaf wetness hours at your average temperature, it won't happen. So we'll go back to NUA and we'll sort of look at some of these things. When you see cold, a lot of times it's not a big rain event. This one particularly is showing up, but it's these little bits of high relative humidity and extended leaf wetness with fairly cool temperatures. Apple scab low is 57. It doesn't like 43. So for the most part, let's go check out the Hudson Valley. See how they're doing. Let's take Campbell Hall. Similar situation. You can start to see that as we're moving into the Eastern New York region, the ejections are getting much higher. This is that 20% I was talking about. 10% on the 2nd, another 9, another 1% going into the 4th, and you can start to see that we're up for a big infection event coming up. 70 on the 3rd, back down to 57. You can see there'll be a cooling event. And when we talk about fire blight, that'll be a little more apparent as well. Not a lot of rain, tenths of inches, but it's long leaf wetness at temperatures that are great for scab. Let's look at Mike's area. Check the Chazy into the region. It looks worse for Mike. Going up further, we'll go back to the Saratoga region, but it's almost another 20% coming up. Every time Riley and I looked at this, it just kept adding longer and leaf wetness predictions. And we're in the good range, 55 to 60. It says it's going to be in the Lake Champlain. Not a lot of rain, a lot of leaf wetness hours, approaching 30 with reasonable amounts of ejection. Makes me a little bit nervous. If you're well protected going in, that's great. If not, now's the time to put on some protection. This is a pretty decent event. You could use up your cylinder, your Dodine. Talked about that. Or if you have a lot of rust, you could go with a group 3. Spire Super is not a bad one to put out at this time for this sort of big, colder ejection because it's got the Vanguard in there, your group 9, and it's got your group 3. But I think you can probably do this with a nice, well-protected crop. And then what you could do is you could use your single sites later at the end of the period, protecting for whatever is coming on the 7th that we can't see yet. Let's go look at Voorheesville. Don't want to skip the Capital District. See how they're doing. It's even worse. Yeah, 40% ejection. I feel like this is the big one. If you want to go ahead and use up one of your single sites, fine. But, I mean, it's not a lot of rain. So your Captan Mancozeb isn't going to wash off necessarily. If you can get something on in the next day or so before this wetness starts, and those materials will weather the rain event quite nicely because of the mancozeb stickiness and the Kaptan's redistribution. It will just sort of slush around the tree and hopefully kill everything. You could go into your group 3s if you have rust. Group 3s is great for rust, good for powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is more challenging, but it's not the powdery mildew time. Let's move to the west. That's right, it's west. Let's go look at the Finger Lakes area for all our Finger Lakes guests. Let's see how we're doing. It says we're constantly in an infection period. It looks beautiful outside in Geneva. I looked at Geneva. It said the same thing. I think what's happening is we're coming off of some weather where it's kind of damp outside, high relative humidities. Look at these rain amounts. So yeah, it's not raining outside. There's a point to, almost 700ths of or 300ths of rain. But the trees are remaining wet because it is cool enough to keep that moisture in the orchard. And things are germinating. Is all your material washing off? No, but it's getting weathered away with 9%, 3%, 6%, 7%, 1%. You're probably able to spray in this weather if you wanted to. And I guess if you had something like Inspire Super, you could probably definitely reach back into whatever nonsense was happening earlier in the week and press forward into the future with that, particularly if you have rust and other things going on. It's not a bad time for psyllid, so it's great because it's mainly going for apple scab, and that's your principal pest in the area. Let's go to Williamson and Sodus region and see how we're doing. Looks kind of like same story, second verse. And look at that really drops off on May 3rd with that cold. That will slow down the infection. That means more leaf wetness hours at the mills table, but you're looking at 38 leaf wetness hours. That's a big one. Look at that 28%. Every time I refresh the model, the percentage just gets larger and it creeps on into Sunday. I would say go out and make sure you're protected now. And maybe go to the psyllid or nice Captazeb if you can put it on. Let's head up to Appleton, and then we'll go back, and Riley's going to talk about fire blight. Appleton North. Oh, what does it look like? Oh, they've just come off a bigger one, and it looks like the Niagara region is not getting the same levels of ejection, providing probably a better opportunity to go in with protectants and weather these rains. Now, they're almost getting a half an inch of rain in the coming weekend, so it's a little more wash off, but that's not enough to destroy Kaptan Mancozeb. That's just enough to kind of keep it sort of reduced. Now, if you don't have Kaptan Mancozeb because you can't purchase it, now maybe I do the Inspire Super or rely on your Dodine psyllid if you can. Particularly if you're able to apply that Dodine around now-ish, you could probably clean up anything that slipped through in that big 17% and go forward into the coming weekend. Look quite nice with that. All right, I'm going to minimize this for a bit, and Riley's going to switch back and talk about fire blight. And we're going to go to this. No, oh gosh, I've done the duplicate button, and now we've lost the screen share. I hate it when this happens. No, let's end this. Hold on. It'll be back up in a second. Swap. And then where's the Zoom? Zoom, did we just get kicked off this thing?
For sure.
No, we're not doing anything right now. Crying. Oh, what's happening? Now we're sharing. Now we're sharing with gasoline. And then don't duplicate. There we go. Now you're ready for fire blight. Go.
All right. Thank you, Kerik. Zoom is always a trial. Yeah, so to finish up on the fire blight update, so just to recap on the weather, because we always have to keep the weather in mind for the disease triangle. So what's conducive for the disease to develop. So late April and March was cold, but we had short spurts of hot weather followed by rain. So the hot weather and rain is going to be conducive for infection later on. So who's in bloom? It's most likely orchards in Eastern New York, the Capital District, and Long Island. And just a reminder that the computers, might be predicting earlier blooms than what you're experiencing in your orchard. So just double check that early or the first blossom open date on the models on NUA, and Kerik he'll share with that in a little bit too. And just to recap what happened last year, so 2024 fire blight, Western New York had a cold bloom period. So it was actually a pretty light fire blight year in Western New York, which was good. Eastern New York, however, it was warm and there was a late bloom period that was also wet. So they had pretty decent epidemics of fire blight last year. And to look forward to what we're seeing here soon. So it's been warm and we've had a lot of scattered rains and we're starting to be in bloom all throughout New York. So it's maybe shaping up to be a fire blight year. So if you are in bloom and you're a conventional operation, get your antibiotics out, so streptomycin or Coumadin, and just a reminder to apply that in the evening. If you're an organic operation, you could apply the biopesticide Blossom Protect, and just a reminder, you want to get that out 2 to 3 days prior to the infection event. And if your flowers are closed, don't apply because flowers need to be open for the infection to occur. If you're in pink, you could go with a plant growth regulator plant defense system, so PGR SAR. So that would look like 6 ounces per 100 gallon of perhexadione calcium, or you could go 2 ounces of Prohex plus an ounce of Actigard per 100 on young trees. And what we're doing here, so the PGR aspect is preventing blossom clusters from being invaded. And the SAR component is boosting defenses for later bloom infections. And I'll hand it back over to Kerik to go look at NUA.
Let's go see what's happening. Let's start in Niagara and look at their fire blight and see what it says. Oh, we're already here. I got to pick a different location. Oh, now look what I've done. Here we go. All right, let's maximize this. Oh, we're happen to be there. Says you're golden. And there's not a single early cultivar open. If it was open, it is predicting bloom at 429. You can see that these computers just like, yep, that can use that degree day. It's just a number. Trees have to respond with physiology, and they may not be as far along as others. So we're looking, it looks pretty good. It's cold, it's wet, it's not great fire blight weather for the Niagara region. Things are looking great. Let's move closer to the east, and we'll go back to what it's saying. Take a look. Oh, it looks like the end of days. If for some reason you didn't have first blossom open, you believe on the 24th, when you actually rechange the dates, it does make the prediction a little bit. Let's just say it was the 27th. You can see the numbers are starting to get a little bit different, and if you're like, well, I think it's today. And you'll notice like, wow, this is really strange. Look at Cougar Blight. It's showing 400 extreme weather, but the EIP says it's totally normal. Let's go back and we'll go ahead and put our blossom back open on the 24th. And you can see that there was setting the early blossom date does make you aware of an EIP value approaching 100. You're like, well, why are these two models different? So the EIP prediction, which is also the same logic as in Mary Blight, uses a couple of different things. It needs to have open flowers. It needs to have adequate temperature. If it dips, it's going to drop the infection risk down, and it needs to have accumulated heat hours, and it can't have a cold spike or anything else. So what ends up happening is when you start to see high EIPs, but the risk level's low, that means we've had a really cold drop in the temperature at night. If we scroll down here, you can kind of see, see, it was getting ready to hit 100, but then we had that cold drop, and the average was 43, which completely destroyed it. The heat has still accumulated. Yeah, I still got the heat. But everything else was gone. And on top of that, there was no moisture, which takes all the predictions and throws them back to the green low level. So that's different ways to consider how these two models play. Do you need to worry if you're open? If you have an early cultivar and they're open flowers, let's take a look. EIP says don't worry about it. Just maybe stick to a biological or something soft and save the antibiotics for later. Cougar Blight is catastrophizing, and it's going to be rainy, but consider susceptibility by risk, by the fact that the EIP model's like you're getting a lot of cold dips at night, the bacteria can't do it. If I were to go out and try to inoculate your plants, I would fail, even with a big glob of fire blight. If you're a grower and you're trying to make a living off of it, it would probably be a disaster and you probably get killed. So you have to balance those two different things together. I would not over stress about this one, but take it a little more lightly, but don't do nothing, if you will. Let's go see what the Finger Lake says. We don't actually have a lot of open flowers in Geneva, but early cultivars are moving along. And this is where we get that really strange period. We have that really hot day on April 29th that was getting up to 80. And then we had that big cold dip. Look what it does to the EIP. It says, oh, we're toast. We didn't really have any flowers earlier on the 29th, but we're starting to see them now. And now both models are coming into alignment on May 2nd. I think I would protect the crop in this particular instance. The cold dip isn't enough to drop that EIP coming up on the 2nd into warm weather. Do we have rain? We've got lots of rain, and we have a 66 degree. I could kill my blocks with fire blight under these conditions. So I'd say if you're in the Finger Lakes, time to protect them. Let's go Capital, then we'll go to Chazy. See what we're doing. Oh, goodness gracious. The Capital District is not looking good. They had that big dip, high EIP. There must have been a cold dip at night that didn't push this into infection. But now we've got the double whammy. Both models are saying, yep, May 2nd is bad. It's just like the Finger Lakes, except hotter and with more tents. And you do have rain. You got a leaf wetness hour of 1. You've got 4 and 23 on the days coming up. You got 65, 66. What is the fire blight bacterium's favorite temperature? It's 78. 66 is still enough to make it grow. I would say go for the crop. If you want to do the blossom protect, like Riley mentioned, 2 to 3 days earlier, Kassuman, go at night. It will degrade in the sunshine. If it's overcast, it'll be fine. It will degrade in the sunshine. Both strep and Kassuman work better at night because it seems that the population surge at night, according to some research that has come out of Michigan State recently. So if you get them on in the evening, generally a little bit better off. Let's go check out the Chazy region. And then next thing you know, we'll be taking questions. Oh, if your flowers open today, you're looking pretty good. Let's just pretend you had something even open a few days earlier. What does it really show? You don't really get into the super high risk environment. You only 50 EIP. The threshold's around 100 for taking action. Unless you have a highly susceptible early flowering cultivar, I would just go on about my business or use something inexpensive or light if you felt inclined to do it. May 1st, you are getting 62, but everybody else is in this green, too cold for fire blight weather, and you're kind of moving fine. We go back down to the Hudson Valley, and I think we're going to start to see the terror is back. Yeah, 138 high EIPs. This cold dip at night did not push it into full infection area. But if you might want to go forward and protect against this huge blob of cougar blight, huge EIPs of really high levels. And do we have leaf wetness? It's not 78, but it's 68. That's really high. Fire blight can do this in between the 2 days. It's not a lot of rain, but we'll all remember that one season where it was dry and we still got fire blight. And even the dew in the canopies or even the application of applying strep can cause trouble. Let's go to Riverhead. See how we're doing. One day they will fix that station. I don't know why it's so sad. They're great. They're deep into bloom. 419, but you know what? It's all this cold weather is kicking those populations so they can't build up on the open flowers and cause trouble. Would I even worry about this? Probably not. I think maybe I'd put some blossom protect out over the weekend and let that colonize the flowers and keep you protected. And with that, I think that's all. I didn't skip any places, right? Nope. Let's there's a pile of questions. Let's we'll unshare and then we can
I can
we can
go
ask
ahead and ask you. Yeah, I'll ask you the questions for simplicity. So we have a question about SAR materials, how long it takes for them to kick in.
All right, kick in 3 to 5 days ish. Blossom Protect seems to be a little faster. I can do it maybe 2 or 3 days to get good levels of control. It does both a blocking of the holes in the floral cup, stopping fire blight from getting in there. It doesn't kill the populations that are there, and it will induce a SAR effect. And it looks like about that one, I'd say maybe 2 to 3 days. The others could take a little bit longer. Think about them like PGRs. If it's cold and the tree is not doing a lot of photosynthesis that one might need for PGRs to work really well, trees aren't going to process these SAR materials as effectively. All right.
Maybe on that note as well, do you have in your mind just like a list that you could run down of the most common aside from Blossom Protect? Like when we say SARs, you know,
yeah, there is a list. The ones I would recommend is the ActiGuard. It's probably the number one. And Blossom Protect is a recently proven SAR effect that you have. The most effective ones tends to be ActiGuard. You've got Regalia, you've got Lifeguard. I've used them quite successfully in our orchards. Some of the Bacillus, the Mycetes Mucoides J, that's the Lifeguard. Vasaplant is another one. But the synthetic ones really skip a lot of the middle person. How do the natural ones work? They fake an infection that causes the plant to turn on plant defenses. It turns on a cascade of a whole bunch of different biochemical signals. But what ActiGuard does is go straight past all of that fake infection and just starts turning on the defense pathways immediately by being an analog of salicylic acid, which is one of the first steps in the process. So it will go a little quicker. And there seems to be a synergy by including it with a little bit of ProHex in terms of making its response.
So would it be safe to say that anything that's not strep or basically if it's not an antibiotic, then it is an SAR and it needs to go on before infection?
Not always. The double nickels and a lot of the other bacillus products are making a natural antibiotic in a soup. Streptomycin comes from a bacteria that lives on cow poop. And that's originally where it was isolated. And a chemist just decided to purify it and make it more effective. But what the other ones are, many of the others are those bacteria. They're not on cow poop in your tank, but they're in a situation that forces them to make the antibiotic naturally, allowing you to use them in organic agriculture. But to be honest, they're still making an antibiotic. It's just under natural fermentation type conditions. So most of the things like that, like double nickel, Serafel, they all work fine too. And in the low pressure environments, put them out, if you will. Oxidate is another thing, but it could be very damaging. I get scared about using that one around bloom. Then so far, we didn't burn anything in our blocks yet, but we don't have any flowers out. Also, a bunch of the other products. Oils are fine as well, but be very careful with Captan.
So in terms of, to keep things quick, in terms of kickback, that's just strep, right? Is there anything else?
I've managed to successfully use Coumadin kickback up to 48 hours in a study I did once, but it doesn't seem to have the same lasting effect on knocking down the populations in the tree. Strep seems to be the best kickback material. The bacteriostatic antibiotics, the Oxytet ones, any of the Oxytet products only stop bacteria from growing, they don't kill it. So their kickback's very limited. I would go strep, and then, if you have a resistance, go Coumadin with that as well. But of the biologicals, Blossom Protect is probably the most effective at studies across the country and worldwide.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. I think for the sake of timing, we're going to push over to Terence, but there was one other question in the chat.
I'll answer, Chris, on the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I think our next speaker today will be Terence Robinson. He really needs no introduction. So if you are ready to share your slides, Terence.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about some options for blossom thinning. I'll give a few comments about what to look forward to in terms of petal fall and later at the 10 millimeter, but I'm going to focus mostly on blossom thinning today. So I wanted to review quickly what happened last year and how it impacts us this year. In 2024, last spring, most blocks had a heavy bloom, but we were impacted by frost. And so there was considerable damage in some blocks in Western New York, not so much in other parts of the state. That resulted in some crop reduction, but there was a lot of poor finish, russet, and other misshapen issues related to the frost. We also had this situation, which I'm trying to protect against in what I'm going to say this year, of high temperatures that were 90 degrees between petal fall and full bloom. And that high temperature gave a natural thinning, and when we superimposed chemical treatments on top of it, resulted in some over thinning. But we also got really good thinning where we needed it. Now, as we move forward through the year, the temperatures in this winter were consistently cold up until we got to March. And so we accumulated almost no heat units in January and February, which in terms of the tree physiology is good. There's been a correlation that years in which we have a consistently cold winter, we have a higher crop as a result of what's happening within the tree and better fruit set. Now, as I look around a bit, I haven't seen as much as I would like to because I don't get out as much, but bloom generally looks good, although some blocks of Honeycrisp and Fuji are light. In our blocks at Geneva, we had a light crop last year, so we've got a really good bloom with Honeycrisp this year. With that sort of introduction, let's talk about how to manage the crop when we have a reasonably good bloom. And I did want to also add the forecast doesn't show any frosts in western New York. There's a chance of frost in the capital district, but it's low, in my opinion. But I don't want to put too much credence into the forecast because it may creep up on us. But assuming there's no frost, we need to manage this crop, and that management begins with first setting the target and then pruning and then blossom thinning. I put up this example just to remind everybody that with Honeycrisp in a tall spindle type of setting, or even other high density systems, we're looking somewhere between 80, 90 fruits per tree. We don't need 120. But with Gala, since yield potential is higher and we don't typically pursue as larger fruits as we do with Honeycrisp, we're looking more at 125 fruits per tree. Now with that, it gives us something to shoot for as we prune, and our suggestion for pruning, which should be done already but can still be touched up, is to leave a few extra insurance buds for Honeycrisp. Should take you up to around 160 buds per tree. Just make sure you're not leaving more than 175 clusters on Honeycrisp generally. With Gala, the target number is higher. We use a different factor of 1.5 times the target number, and that's 186 buds per tree, but don't leave more than 200. Now, a number of people have used computer vision to count, and it's worked well, and some growers have begun to utilize that in their pruning decisions. But the topic for today really is how to start through this precision chemical thinning process, which has sequential sprays of thinning beginning at bloom. And today we're going to talk specifically about the bloom thinning options, but I do want to point out from this diagram that you should be ready to think about putting on a petal fall spray around 110 to 130 degree days after bloom, which coincides typically with fruits that are 5 millimeters up to 6. We don't want to spray when they're first out of petal fall. When they're 4 millimeters, the fruits do not respond much to the thinners, but at 5 to 6, they do respond. And then be prepared for the other sprays at their respective degree day accumulations after bloom. But to focus on bloom thinning, it's very critical for Honeycrisp and other biennial bearing varieties. We just haven't been able to control biennial bearing in Honeycrisp without blossom thinning. It's largely related to the internal physiology of the tree. The seeds produce gibberellins, and that is an anti-flowering hormone. And so the earlier in the season that fruit number can be reduced, or more specifically, that seed number per tree can be reduced, the greater likelihood you can have of having flowers initiated for next year. And this seed number issue, I'd like to point out in the bottom part of the chart. If you do pruning correctly, and say you prune to 131 buds on Honeycrisp, and then you're able through blossom thinning to thin off all the laterals, leaving only the king, you would be down to 1,300 seeds per tree. But when the tree is pruned very lightly, or we don't get blossom thinning done, you can have, as we go into the 10, 12 millimeters, 4,000 seeds per tree. We just can't seem to overcome the gibberellin production of 4,000 seeds. It would be interesting for you to cut some fruits around the 10 millimeters, see how many seeds you're ending up with, because some years we don't end up with 10 seeds per fruit, we end up with 4. But then multiply how many seeds you're finding in the fruit by how many fruits are on the tree, and see where you are in terms of total seed number per tree. If you're closer to 1,500 seeds per tree, or if you're 4,000 or higher. So the combination of precision pruning and blossom thinning are the key steps in trying to overcome biennial bearing with Honeycrisp, Fuji, and other varieties that are prone to biennial bearing. Now for 2025, there are several options for bloom thinning sprays. Now, we'd have 2 caustic products that are labeled now. Lime sulfur was just labeled earlier this year. So I want to spend a little bit of time on talking about those two products. Alternatively, hormone thinners also work, and I'll spend less time talking about them. First ATS that we've had for many years in this state. It's a caustic product because of the sulfur that's attached to the nitrogen compound. It tends to burn just the stigmatic surface of the pistil. And you can remember from your biology that the pistil is composed of the stigma on top, the style, that is the neck connecting it to the ovaries. But ATS is not that caustic to the entire pistil. It only burns the stigma. And so you have to spray it pretty much as soon as the pollen might appear on that pistil. Therefore, we tend to use a pollen tube growth model, but spray earlier at 60% of the model instead of 100%. It does have the potential to cause margin leaf burning at high rates, but it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on fruit finish. It does require 2 applications, and although it's not registered as a thinner, it can be used legally as a foliar nitrogen fertilizer. Now, this year we have available a separate class or separate product, lime sulfur, and it works best when it's added with oil. It's newly registered. Only the Miller chemical brand is registered as a thinner, even though there are other companies that make lime sulfur. But it burns both the tip of the pistil, the stigma, but also the neck of the pistil called the style. Therefore, pollen tubes that are starting to grow down that style, when sprayed with lime sulfur, it will kill that pollen tube. It won't kill pollen tubes that have already passed through the full neck of the pistil and are down close to the ovaries. And so therefore, we can spray this at a slightly later stage on the pollen tube growth model, and we're recommending 80%. Now, the people in Washington that have had the most experience with this are typically now all spraying at 80%, which is what we recommend. It's more consistent at getting blossom thinning done than ATS. It does also require 2 applications, but the issue with lime sulfur is that the closer you get to petal fall, the more potential it has to cause fruit finish problems. Now, the physiology behind this is that fruit surface cells have to produce wax as the fruit starts to expand, and they really don't expand very much through bloom. They're 3 to 4 millimeters in diameter. But once you get to petal fall, the fruit starts to grow rapidly, and that's why we want to put the petal fall spray on after they've started that growth rush at 5 millimeters instead of at 3 to 4. But once they're growing fast, the cells that are producing wax have to produce enough wax to keep up. And if they are damaged by lime sulfur, then you get russet. And russet is the plant's response to save that fruit so it doesn't dehydrate. When we spray lime sulfur at petal fall, it inhibits photosynthesis, and it's quite caustic. Therefore, it should not be applied close to petal fall. Now, in the West, where they have dry conditions and much, much less problem with russeting, they spray 3 and 4, and in some cases 5 applications of lime sulfur so they can take care of all of the bloom on 1-year wood. But here I'm hesitant to ever recommend more than 2 applications. And I'll talk about how to use the pollen tube growth model in just a few more slides. Now, some people are just not comfortable with the caustics, although we have lots of experience commercially with ATS, and we have more than a decade of experience in experiments with lime sulfur and oil. But hormone products, NAA or NAD, also can help. And the way they help during bloom is by serving as seed toxicants and killing the young little seed as it's starting to develop. They're very safe. They don't cause overthinning, and they can be sprayed at high rates during bloom, 10 parts per million for NAA or 50 parts per million for NAD. But the timing for this is to wait closer to full bloom, and instead of trying to spray these early, because you want to wait until that little seed has been fertilized and then kill it with some NA or NAD, which produces some ethylene. These have both been shown to help improve the return bloom of Honeycrisp, but they're not as effective at knocking off lateral bloom as are the caustic, especially lime sulfur. So where a cluster has a king and 4 laterals, the goal with blossom thinning would be knock off all 4 laterals. But with NAA, we tend to not knock off that many laterals, although we do reduce the seed number per fruit. So getting back to what I said earlier, the total number of seeds per tree would be less when you use NA, but you still have a lot of those lateral fruits going to grow, and you've got to try to thin them off post-bloom. So there's some positives and negatives about both approaches. And I've talked about this before, but I want to review it here. When would I choose to use one of the 2 caustics versus one of the hormone thinners at bloom? I think that for both Honeycrisp and Gala, when weather conditions are decent, they're better choices. And that would be when there's no frost, which is likely to be the case this year. When it's not too hot, that's going to be the case this year because we're not projected to have any 90-degree days. With good bee flight, but also that bloom is not too fast. Now, the problem with the caustics when bloom happens fast is you start the model and you have to spray one day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and by the next day at 10 a.m., you have to put on the second spray because everything goes by so fast. So they're very difficult to use when we have this rapid bloom. So I would prefer to use a hormone type thinner under those conditions when there has been some frost, because NAA won't take off all the fruit. It just affects seed number. Or when we've had poor bee flight and maybe the seed number isn't all that high anyway to start with. Or when bloom happens fast because the timing of NAA or NAD is not so critical. And also if temperatures are hot, NAA is more potent at hot temperatures, but at bloom, it will not cause overthinning. Or maybe you're just a person that just doesn't like the idea of spraying caustic materials and worried about fruit finish. So that would be my recommendation of how to choose which one of those. It looks to me that the forecasts for when we have bloom in Western New York would be, this is a good year to use caustic thinners, and I would prefer lime sulfur and oil versus ATS. Now let me just say that the choice between ATS and lime sulfur is a personal one. If you feel comfortable and you've had good success now for years with ATS, continue. I think that now that we have a legal lime sulfur and oil product, we'll be more successful in general with bloom thinning than we have been with ATS. Now, it's critical that you use a pollen tube growth model when you use one of these caustic products. It begins by, as soon as you have some kings open, measuring the pistil length. And that is done according to this little picture on the right. You remove the petals from the flower, and then you measure with a very fine digital caliper the length between where the sepals, those are the green flat pieces, where those are flat to the top of the pistil, and it's in millimeters, and should be somewhere between 8 and 12 millimeters. Then you watch carefully the trees. In this case, let's assume it's Honeycrisp. You need to know when enough Honeycrisp flowers are open, which are the ones you want to keep, ones you want to have fertilized and not knock them off, because that's when you start the model. So when enough flowers are open, let's just assume, because it's an easy number, that you use the number that I calculated earlier of 87 fruits as your final target. When 87 king flowers are open, you would then go into NUA and start the model. Now, what NUA pollen tube growth model then does is use temperature forecast to predict how fast those pollens are going to grow down that style and pollinate or fertilize the eggs, because once they get down past the base of the style, they're home free, and these caustics won't kill them. But other flowers that open a little later and a bee visits them 6 hours later or 12 hours later, their pollen tubes won't be that far down, and the caustic sprays will kill them. So what I repeat again, just so that nobody forgets, ATS is not as toxic and not as powerful of a product. Therefore, when the model reaches 80%, you spray, or 60%. Whereas lime, sulfur, and oil is a more powerful product, and we want to spray when it reaches 80. Now, the picture, the graph below, is from the pollen tube growth model in NUA. I just did this morning. I had to put in, like, let's say we had the first flower open on the 25th. That's not true, but based upon temperatures at Geneva, you can see how the pollen tubes grew. We had a warm day, and then we had a cool day where the curve was flat, and then a little bit of warmth. But it reached, at least according to this bloom date, on 28th at 11 a.m., it reached 80%. And you would go out and spray your Honeycrisp with lime, sulfur, and oil. Then we had a really warm day and a little night, and then a really warm day, and it would have reached 80% again, the second peak on the 29th in the afternoon. And then you would spray again. Then you can see under this scenario, it's progressed more slowly because it was cooler yesterday, and right now we're at this vertical black line, but it's predicted to go up sharply, and we would reach 80% again in another day. However, I don't want to put 3 lime, sulfur, and oil sprays on. If you wanted to come back with an ATS spray for the third, that would be fine. But generally what it means that in New York, we're going to try to influence the number of lateral fruits on spurs. But what this doesn't get is all the bloom on 1-year wood, which opens 4 or 5 days later. And we totally miss that with these back-to-back sprays of lime, sulfur, and oil. Hopefully we can take those off with our petal fall sprays of NA and 7 or Maxell and Exceed, as I'll talk about in a minute. Now, we've had great success. This is just a little bit of fun stuff to pique your interest, using digital cameras to count the number of flowers. And so we're doing quite a bit of work this year, both at Geneva and on 2 growers' farms, one in Orleans and one in Wayne County, where we're going to use cameras to map how many flowers are on each tree, and then use that to guide the sprayer in blossom thinning. And this charts just show that we're fairly close with what we count with the camera and what we count by hand. But ultimately, we want to use variable rate spraying. And my postdoc, Brian Lawrence, is leading this effort, and we hope that it'll be successful. On the left of this picture, which is from a Dutch variety called Elstar in the Netherlands, you see actual pictures of the trees from a drone. And the whiter ones have lots of flowers, and the greener ones had no flowers. And from this, we create a task map, which the sprayer then utilizes to turn the spray on the trees that have lots of flowers and not turn it on the trees that have no flowers. I think this is going to be a tremendous advance over the next few years, especially for varieties that have difficulty with return bloom when we get this variable bloom level in some years, and particularly with Honeycrisp. Now, I want to focus on just a couple of specific suggestions for both Honeycrisp and Gala. So my strategy for Honeycrisp this year, assuming that you have a really good amount of bloom and you have at least 200 clusters on a tree, is to start with a blossom spray, 2 blossom sprays of lime sulfur, 2.5% lime sulfur and 2% oil. Don't reverse those. A little bit higher percent of lime sulfur than oil. Then use a pollen tube growth model, measure pistil length and put that into the model, and then spray when it gets to 80% after enough flowers have opened, the 87 flowers that you want to have apples on. Now, the complication with lime sulfur is captan, because the lime sulfur utilizes oil to make it more potent. And the whole issues of Captozeb being so common and used almost every other day make it difficult sometimes to use lime sulfur. They don't have this problem in the West. But if you're planning to use lime sulfur and oil as a blossom thinner, you can't put captan in the spray for scab before you spray the lime sulfur or for 7 days after you spray, because the oil will cause too much captan to be absorbed by the leaf and will cause phytotoxicity. I acknowledge this as a real issue for us in the East, and because of this, some will choose just to stick with ATS, recognizing that ATS isn't quite as powerful of a thinner as is lime sulfur and oil. I would follow that up then with Honeycrisp with a Na and 7, a full shot of 4 ounces to the acre and 7, and then follow that with a slightly lower dose when fruits are 11 to 12 millimeters of 3 ounces of Na and 7. And if needed, you come, because we didn't get good thinning because the carbohydrate balance was all the wrong way, we can then come back with Exceed and the Maxell at the 15 to 20 millimeter stage. I want to contrast that with Gala, which is a very difficult to thin variety in most of our blocks. I think you have to start with Promelin at first King Bloom, and for Geneva, we're getting close to the first King Bloom opening on Gala. But the big spray then comes at full bloom. Here again, I like lime sulfur using the pollen tube growth model at 80%, spray 2 times. Again, the warning, don't use Captan 7 days before or 7 days after that oil spray. But the difference comes here at petal fall. Over the last couple of years, we've had really good success with Maxell and Exceed at petal fall. Now, over the years, I've used almost every single year in trials Na and 7 at petal fall. And on Gala, most years it does very little. On an occasional really warm year, it does pretty decent. But Maxell and Exceed seems to be a product that works quite well at petal fall. I want to just explain my reasoning a little bit. We learned from work that Pollyanna did that some varieties of apple tend to produce a lot of ethylene right around bloom and through petal fall. Sweet Tango is the #1 poster child for this. But we've also learned that Evercrisp also produces ethylene, and those varieties tend to thin easy and tend to have natural drop because of the ethylene they're producing. Well, when you put Exceed on at petal fall, you're essentially giving the tree a dose of ethylene. It has to be converted from Exceed to ethylene, but that connected with Maxell gives us kind of what we were getting with those varieties that produce ethylene naturally at bloom and petal fall. And so it tends to work well in many, many situations. Even though it's a little bit expensive, when we have a hard time thinning Gala, I've had better success using this at petal fall than I've had using Na and 7. Then we come back at the 11 to 12 millimeter stage and put Maxell and 7 on with a full dose in our typical spray that is the money spray where we hope to get a lot of thinning. If that doesn't work, we come back with Exceed and Maxell again. Now, this is my suggested thinning for Gala where you have a hard time getting things thinned. Now, the problem is the carbohydrate balance. I contrast here 2 years, 2023, which had no deficit at any time through the thinning period. I have marked their full bloom. To petal fall, we were at a surplus of carbohydrates, a 10 millimeter surplus, 16 millimeter surplus, and we couldn't get anything to really thin properly with Gala, and cost a lot of hand thinning in that year. But I contrast that with last year, 2024, and we had this huge deficit when fruits were about 8 to 10 millimeters, a little bit before the 10 millimeter stage. But by the time we got to 16 millimeters, we had no deficit. So in our trials at Geneva, when we sprayed either right before that 10 millimeter at 7, 8, 10 millimeters, we got tremendous thinning response from all the different products. But when we had different experiments, so treatments where we're spraying late, no matter what we sprayed, Exceed or Brevis, the new product, or Maxell and Exceed, we could not get thinning because of the carbohydrate surplus that was impacting us. So the worst of all worlds is 2023, when nothing seemed to be the optimum for thinning, and that then is a real challenge and would require then the full sequence of blossom thinning, petal fall thinning, 10 millimeter and 16 millimeter thinning. But it again illustrates the necessity I think, of having a fairly serious blossom thinning effort with lime, sulfur, and oil if you can work around the cap 10 issue. Now, last year, because we had this issue of extreme heat and extreme carbohydrate deficits right around the 10 millimeter fruit size, I've had to become a little more conservative in what I put in the carbohydrate model, because severe carbohydrate deficits of more negative than -50, they give a natural thinning action to the tree, causing many fruits to fall off. And it's the same thing as having sprayed a really strong chemical spray on them. But if you combine this natural thinning from the carbohydrate deficit with a strong chemical, you get over thinning. And hence, the newest version of the carbohydrate model that you'll see will, if we get conditions of negative carbohydrate balance, more negative than -50, it's going to tell you do not thin. It says wait for a better timing. So I've listed here kind of the rules that model is going to use. I want to emphasize two things. We'll probably talk again in another meeting, but maybe not everybody around the state. But if we get into this 10 millimeter timing and the carbohydrate balance is positive, say more than +10 grams, say it's 20 grams, you've got to increase the rate of your chemical, and I would like you to add Regulate. If the carbohydrate balance is more close to 0 to +10, you only increase rates by 15%, but still add Regulate. But whenever the carbohydrate balance is below 0, we don't ever add Regulate. So if it's 0 to -20, just apply whatever we tell you in the recommends. That's our standard rate. If it's more negative, between -20 and -30, you should start decreasing rates. But if it's really negative between -30 and -50, you've got to really substantially decrease rate. But anytime the 6-day average is more negative than -50, just don't spray. You have to wait it out. Wait for a different window when the deficit, 6-day average deficit, is not so negative. Now, with all these sequential sprays, I don't think you can really manage apples in the modern world without knowing what each spray does. Hence, the fruit growth rate model becomes an essential tool in trying to figure out what you accomplished with your bloom lime sulfur and your petal fall spray of whatever it is. And so the best way is to measure fruitlet diameters 2 times, as we've done in the past. This method of hand measurements gives very accurate assessments. We continue to try to find simpler, less time-consuming ways to do it. We had a wonderful system with the cell phone videos, but that company no longer makes it available. I had some recent information they might bring it back next year, but not this year. Todd Einhorn has published this system where you can go pick 200 fruits and weigh each one on a scale and put it into his model. Might be a little faster than measuring fruits with a digital caliper. But we're hoping that I can also work with 2 other camera systems, Orchard Robotics and Vivid, to try to use their camera systems to do this. But we don't have anything for 2025 except the hand measurement. So I encourage you to go back out and measure fruit diameters with the caliper. I'll end with just a reminder that this is, for Honeycrisp, is all part of a big effort to get return bloom. So I'm suggesting you spray lime sulfur and oil 2 times during bloom, come back in with some NaN7 at petal fall, another NaN7 at 12 millimeters. Hopefully you won't need any thinning at 15 to 18 millimeters, but at 16 to 17, 18 millimeters, you should put on a low rate of ethereal or a low rate of exceed to start inducing return bloom, and then follow that up with 3 more sprays of ethereal at a full rate every week or 10 days. Lastly, I'll just throw out a couple additional thoughts about tips. You've got to look if most kings are present. The blocks I've seen mostly have kings. We did not lose kings this year in the winter or the March time period. And then that implies that we want to use full rates and follow what the carbohydrate model says. Time your sprays using the pollen tube growth model for bloom, and then degree days for the post-bloom sprays. I want to reemphasize that the sprayer should be nozzled differently. For the bloom sprays, we've got to have the chemical land on the pistil of every flower. And so therefore, uniformly application from the top to the bottom of the tree with relatively small droplet size will give the best coverage of every pistil on that tree that's open at that time. But once we get to the petal fall spray, we want to put more chemical in the top than in the bottom. And certainly once we get to 12 millimeter, we want to concentrate quite a bit of the spray in the top because we almost always overthin the bottoms. In our trials, we've got almost uniform distribution of fruits from the bottom to the top. When we do this, 75 in the top and 25% in the bottom for that 10 to 12 millimeter spray. Certainly, once we get to 18 millimeter, if we need that, you only want to spray the top of the tree, nothing to the bottom. And then lastly, to formally put this out, anytime you have a carbohydrate deficit that's positive, or not, I should have not written it that way. You have a carbohydrate surplus, include a surfactant like Regulate. But wherever the carbohydrate balance is negative or a deficit, don't include Regulate. So with that, I'd like to answer any questions, and I hope there's enough time in your schedule before bloom to organize yourselves to be successful with blossom thinning this year.
All right, thank you very much, Terence. If anybody has any questions for Terence, feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box. We'll get those answered for you. Just as a leading question, Terence, I did see in the guidelines, maybe for folks that might not feel confident with the pollen tube growth model this year, but still want to try out lime sulfur or ATS, there's the recommendation of 30% full bloom and 80% full bloom for 2 sprays. Just want to hear your thoughts on that as far as efficacy or precision, as far as using those time markers for using these 2 materials.
So those are just estimates to try to accomplish what the pollen tube growth model is suggesting. And we put those in the recommends before we had the pollen tube growth model, and I haven't remembered to take them out. I really suggest the pollen tube growth model is the best. But think about it, if 30% of the flowers are open, that's a third, each cluster has 5, so that would be 2 out of 5. You have the king and 1 lateral open, and you have enough kings on there, if you pruned right, for 1.8 times, and you add 1 lateral on there, you've got enough laterals open to have 3 times as many fruits as you need. So to wait any longer is probably counterproductive. And that usually takes only 2 days to put on the second application, and that's usually the 60% or 70% bloom.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, not seeing any other questions. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their time today. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. We did record this meeting, so I expect to get an email with the link to that in the next day or 2. And I'm sure in the next 2 days here, we'll be planning out our petal fall and our future thinning update meeting. So we'll see you all then, if not before. So thank you very much.